Hello, welcome to Circle One. My name is John.
And I'm Jeff.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us, Jeff.
My pleasure.
Thank you as well to the viewers in the chat on Twitch joining us. We're very excited for today's episode. And Jeff is kind of my newest, oldest friend. My oldest, newest friend?
Sure. I'll take it.
Somewhere in there. Today's episode is going to be a professional profile. On Circle One, we've got a few different episode types. Some of them are panel discussions. We do a bit of a live talk show kind of format. Some of them we bring on Auxesis independent contractors. So we work with a distributed pool of independent contractors on a recurring basis. And we're hoping to profile some of those interesting young professionals, creatives, technical people. And then a few of the episodes that we do are professional profiles, where we have one individual on the show. And I'm very honored to say that Jeff is our third professional profile for episode 16 of Circle One. Excellent. So I'm going to jump into a brief introduction to Circle One, and then we're going to get to learning a bit about Jeff, and hopefully we are going to talk risk and reward before the episode's out. How's that sound, Jeff?
Sounds great. I'm in.
Excellent. Oh, McHuntington says, happy Friday. Happy Friday to you as well, Mr. McHuntingtons, and everybody else out there in the world. We are very happy that it's Friday. An intro to Circle One. Circle One is a live streaming talk show every Friday at noon. The kind of subtitle is The Future of Work and Leadership. And here at Auxesis, we have a little bit of a thesis, the Auxesis thesis. And that thesis is that work and leadership are changing quite a bit. We're in a period of change. The way people work and get work done, the way people lead, the way people organize, the way people build their careers and their working lives is seeing some vast and drastic changes. And so we were working with our creative strategist trying to come up with a name for the show. And we liked the idea, the feel of the name Circle One. Sorry, we like the idea of the name Square One, but we thought something was off because Square One typically means to take a project and scrap it because it's bunk and start again totally from scratch. Another part of the Auxesis thesis is that we think there are a lot of good things in our traditional conceptions of almost everything, including working life and professional endeavors. And so Square One didn't quite land exactly as we wanted it to. And so we thought, well, Circle One. Maybe it's just that the future of working life and leadership is having the shape slightly reimagined as opposed to having the whole project scrapped and rebuilt from scratch. So Circle One, that's the idea of the show. Every Friday at noon Central, we bring on interesting professionals from a wide variety of skills, backgrounds, and areas of expertise. And we're so excited today to learn a bit more about Jeff and chat high level about work and leadership. So without further ado, hello to all the new viewers joining us in the chat. We're so excited you could join us. We are going to learn a little bit more about Jeff Gilbert, principal at the Office of the Auditor General. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, and I hope that you will indulge our viewers with a little bit of information about you, your background, your experience, and your day-to-day.
Sure. So I'll start off on the academic side of things. I did a Bachelor of Commerce from University of Manitoba with a double major of accounting and marketing. I did a Master's of Professional Accounting from University of Saskatchewan. I did a Chartered Accounting, or now CPA, and I've been that since 2004. I also did what's called a Diploma in Investigative Forensic Accounting from University of Toronto, because I wanted to be the biggest geek in the world, and so far I'm meeting my expectations. Okay, that's the academic or whatever and quasi-professional side.
Awesome.
It's kind of interesting. I worked at a place, and these places have to remain anonymous you'll see why.
Okay.
But I worked at a place that was like a restaurant, and they didn't pay their taxes. So the RCMP seized all their assets, and obviously they went out of business. And so that was my first real job. My second job, I worked at a place in Winnipeg, and the owner kind of hired a manager who had some drugs and substance problems, and they went bankrupt. The third place I worked was a Crown corporation. And one day when I was there, over a year I had worked there, most of the senior management was let go, i.e., fired, for a cause. And that was for financial shenanigans, expensing things potentially inappropriately, traveling when they shouldn't be traveling on the Crown's dime. And so my basically you don't want to work with me. My resume is full of just a bunch of shenanigans, but it led me down an interesting road of, okay, psychology wise, why are people acting like this? And also fraud wise, forensic wise, forensic, by the way, means for law. So all a forensic accountant means is that we can obtain evidence, we can review and analyze that evidence and assist the trier of fact. So, for example, a judge and say, okay, here's what we saw, here's what occurred. We don't conclude at a forensic level that there was fraud. We conclude that funds are missing. It's for the courts to determine, based on expert advice, that fraud, which would be a criminal thing, or civil, occurred. So day to day, I work at the Office of the Auditor General. I'm a principal and I work in an investigations group. Every September, I teach one course at the University of Manitoba, which is auditing. I do a bunch of work for CPA Western School of Business, including writing cases or contract work or being a facilitator teaching. I do some work with some not-for-profits. I'm on an audit finance committees and involved in some not-for-profits. And also I do some work with some entrepreneurs from time to time for fun.
Awesome. Busy guy.
Okay. Yeah, this sure. Oh, I should mention, people don't mention this, but I should mention, I'm happily married and I have 2 kids. Another big part of my life.
Awesome.
Okay, follow up on that stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So where do you want to start? I'm curious to learn both about your full-time gig and also the side stuff you do, the lecturing, the maybe work, the CPA stuff, the work with entrepreneurs and such. Where do you want to start?
Sure. So like for the Office of the Auditor General, I articled first at Big Four. Then after that, I left, joined the Office of the Auditor General. There's several divisions at the Auditor General's office. One of them is called performance audit. One of them is financial statement audit. One of them is investigations. The bulk of my time is spent on investigatory type work. Mm-hmm. So we have a citizen concern line people can call with various sorts of concerns, and we can do due diligence all the way up to we can write a report which ends up in legislative assembly. Mm-hmm. So lots of that, the work that I do and the work that I'm currently doing on that is like highly confidential, and it's for the Auditor General to public and make it public via the legislative assembly process. Of course, yes. I also do recruitment and like hiring and stuff for the Auditor General's office. So I wear a couple of different hats there. In terms of teaching, I've taught for like 10 years and that's a passion of mine. I'm quite passionate about business, research, auditing, good practice, corporate governance, and I love tying in psychology. Mm-hmm. And then the board work and stuff, like being a former president of a not-for-profit and setting out governance models, policies, setting out budgets, hiring and firing individuals and all that kind of stuff that the board gets involved with, to me is fairly interesting and challenging and a different mindset that I bring to the table.
Okay. I'm going to share with the audience that I always had a certain perspective on audit and maybe even CPAs and maybe even on forensic audit. And Jeff is one of those people who really turned me on to it and got me excited by it, even though he steered me away from it a little bit. But I guess without diving into detail with regards to your day job, I'm curious for anybody who's watching in the audience who hears you say that I'm the principal at the Office of the Auditor General and we do forensic audit and it's for the courts to decide this, that, and the other thing. As a citizen, as a Manitoban, why would I be happy to know that our provincial budgets are being put towards some of the activities that you're taking part in?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Um, um, if there's a not-for-profit that produces every year something called the Corruption Index. This is an international analysis that's done.
Ooh, corruption. Now we're getting exciting.
Okay. Auditor generals have a very unique role. Um, so do inspector generals. And so basically, via government authority, via legislative acts, auditor generals have rights and access. So, for example, if a news media were to call up a crown corporation and say, "Hey, we heard there might be something going on. Can you please share with us your accounting records?"
Mm-hmm.
100% of the time, they're going to be told no.
Mm-hmm.
And if, John, you were to walk into a crown corporation right now and say, "Hey, can I just search through your accounting records?" They would say no.
Ah.
However, auditor generals are independent officers of the Legislative Assembly who have powers prescribed by acts. Many of them say stuff like, "You shall provide information." Many of them contain subpoena powers. Many of them contain seize documents powers. So in other words, we can literally physically take a computer or take documents or take evidence as we deem appropriate. There's not really an option to say no. Furthermore, the Auditor Generals, for most, they're a term position. That's an all-party committee that hires Auditor Generals. They can't really be fired. Once you become the Auditor General, it requires 2/3 of the majority of government typically to remove an Auditor General. When was the last time 2/3 of government of a province or feds agreed on something along those lines? And also, it seemed very, very skeptically if you were to fire an auditor or remove an Auditor General. In other words, it's only done for cause. I've never heard of it done.
Can I ask why that mechanism is placed? I have my suspicions, but maybe
it's all about independence.
Okay.
The Auditor General must not be seen to be, must seen to be seen to be independent. So they provide value-added reports to the Legislative Assembly from what their analysis, their conclusion, their recommendations is telling them. So what they think the Legislative Assembly needs to know is what the work that is done. And so from choosing financial statement audits to do, to performance audits, to investigations, to governance audits, to information technology related audits, internal control based compliance with legislative authorities, like there's a number of levers that can be pulled. Now, tying in what I was talking about in terms of big picture corruption, if you remove an Auditor General, if you say, "I don't want the Auditor General looking," you move up on the corruption index in a bad way, right? So countries that remove Auditor Generals or defund Auditor Generals are seen with, what are they hiding? What sort of corruption is occurring there? Are they trustworthy? So this is a key step in accountability and transparency. Furthermore, depending on which Auditor General we're talking about, but as an example, the Auditor General of Canada, the majority of funding is via the federal government. This means that they're not dependent on clients for billing. Rather, the money is an appropriation that comes in via the legislative process, via Parliament. And so they're not subject to being fired or not being paid. So any incentives like that are removed from the table. So it's a free and clear individual who's professional, who has a skill set, and their teams have skill sets to support in analysis and value-added recommendations to let everyone know. So via the Legislative Assembly, things go public, the media gets to see our reports, etc. So it brings a layer of transparency and accountability, which in my humble opinion is very much a value-add thing.
Okay, great. Tell me if this sounds accurate then. It sounds like there's two layers of benefit to having an Auditor General and having the team in place. I didn't realize this until you started laying it out. It sounds like the first one is almost an international benefit, in that the rest of the world sees us as less corrupt or more professional, or
Sure. And we fall out of like the Westminster system of government, obviously. So Auditor Generals have existed in Britain for well over 100 years. And other countries follow different models, inspector generals, et cetera, government accountability offices in the United States, but it's all a very similar thing.
Okay.
They have powers, they have authorities, and hopefully independence, and they get to look at and examine and bring to light things that should be brought to light.
Awesome.
And the other thing to mention is that we do the audit of the financial statements for the government of Manitoba. All auditor generals in Canada are assigned to do their respective province or the feds. Large consolidated summary financial statements, they're called. Those, like you think about bond rating agencies have to analyze the financial statements. They're relying on Auditor General's opinions.
Okay.
To assign a bond rating for Manitoba bonds, for Saskatchewan bonds, for the government of Canada bonds. So there's layers of who's relying on this and analysis that's occurring.
Okay. And then is it, I guess, safe to say that there is a more local benefit? It sounds like all of these things that you've just laid out now are of benefit at the ground level to the average Manitoban. And is it safe to say that your office and its existence helps give us the peace of mind that businesses are run more ethically, that our government funds are put to use more ethically, that corruption is mitigated and reduced? Is that fair?
The Auditor General certainly has a role to play with that.
Okay.
And I've been involved with investigations, and you can go to www.oag.mb.ca and take a look at reports. Yeah, because there, over the years, a number of things have been examined from a number of different lenses.
Yeah.
Looking at efficiency, looking at effective use of resources, looking at value for money or governance. So yes.
Okay. Well, either way, from everything I've heard you say about the office, I feel like I'm a lucky Canadian and Manitoban to know that that office is in existence and doing the job. So thank you for telling us a little bit more about that. I'm
My pleasure.
Curious to learn more about the lecture stuff. And
yeah, for sure. So I remember sitting in some classes being really, really annoyed. It was like, could you please memorize Maslow's hierarchy of needs and repeat them back on a test? And I'm like, this is, to me, not real learning. Whereas if you start reading like business biographies, you start listening to very successful CEOs, CFOs, and start listening to their stories, it's intriguing, fascinating. And it's not so much memorize, regurgitate, it's application, and there's shades of gray, and there's analysis that's required, and it's complex, and there's no one right answer. What's General Electric worth right now? Like, that's a fascinating question. Why is General Electric way down in terms of market cap valuation? That's a fascinating question. The history of GE is fascinating. So one of the reasons that I teach audit is because it allows for storytelling. It allows for, here's a test that we could do, and here's what the business is doing, and here's how they intermingle, here's how they relate. And speaking of this, I actually need your help. So I'm going to be teaching for the first time in this COVID type environment in September, virtually. Now, the way I do my classes is very participatory. It's very, I chuck a lot out to the class. Hey, raise your hand if you think, would you invest in X company? Why pick them? Why not? If you were analyzing the financial statements, would you say this company is a good company or a bad company based purely on the numbers?
What was one of your questions was, if you had $100 or $1,000 to invest in anyone in this room, who would you invest it in, or something like that?
One of my favorite questions to ask.
Yeah.
If I gave you, if I said you have to invest somebody on this, listening to this call right now, and you have to invest in that individual, who would you choose and why?
Jordan.
And just to jump to some conclusions for a moment here, you'd probably pick an individual who, let's say, is very bright. You'd also want to pick an individual likely who has ethics, who has integrity, who has honesty, but you'd also want to pick an individual who's a good leader, because odds of them making it completely by themselves aren't so good. So they have to have that skill set, right? They have to be a good leader. They have to get other people engaged. They have to be passionate. Cool. You want to pick somebody who is going to be able to leverage and scale and grow. And And so an individual who has just a 99% average, but you know the type that I'm talking about, they're going to work for some individual. They're never going to be an entrepreneur. They're never going to grow a business. They can't deal with that much risk. They can't deal with being punched in the stomach that many times.
Oh boy.
Right. Um, that individual likely won't necessarily have the same returns, although their returns would be more predictable. So there's a whole bunch of analysis that goes into this. But of course, the favorite part of this is my thesis, which is you're never going to own a percentage of somebody else, but you own 100% of you. So if you own 100% of you, shouldn't you build up your own assets, i.e. practice continuous learning, i.e. Be on calls like this, i.e. reach out, network, and try to figure out for yourself, right? And build your own assets. And that includes, by the way, my biggest theme of life is just copying other individuals' good ideas. I don't consider myself to be the best at anything in the world, but I know enough to see when somebody's doing something that's really good to just say, okay, I'm copying that. And so a classic example for me is Ben Franklin. A classic example for me is Charlie Munger. These are individuals who've led just fascinating lives and done remarkable things and are brighter than me in almost every capacity.
Wow.
But when I read their biography, you could still pick out themes, right? You could still pick out lessons from how they lived their life or what they did, and integrate that. That's resulted in positive financial returns for me on the investment side, owning Munger, but it's also resulted in developing a unique skill set in the way you analyze problems because of people like Ben Franklin.
Okay, awesome. I wonder if we can get into those two a little bit. And just to preface that, thinking about lectures, I would have to second and agree with your analysis that a lot of lectures are boring and a lot of testing frameworks are dry and kind of just like lack utility. I was drawn to your interaction, the interactionalism in your lectures. You're getting everybody engaged. You're telling stories. You're asking questions that aren't cut and dry type questions. You're asking for people's opinions. That immediately my eyes lit up when I sat in your lecture. I was like, "Oh man!" I was vibrating watching the lecture for the first time I'd ever seen you lecture. And then you started sharing some of those stories and talking about those heroes and laying out that thesis of emulating folks who have achieved things. And Ben Franklin and Charlie Munger were two that I have always thought were incredibly worthy of emulation. So when you started kind of laying out the breadcrumbs of these Franklinisms and Mungerisms, it was like, then it was just like, oh my gosh, I got to be best friends with this guy. He's amazing.
Thanks.
So would you be able to summarize for the viewers at home, if people are out there wondering, where to find tactics or strategy worthy of emulation, could you maybe lay out a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and maybe even a little bit about Charlie Munger that you found compelling and that worked for you?
There's a ton, so you'll cut me off whenever you want. Benjamin Franklin's nuts. Like nuts. That guy invented bifocals. That guy discovered that there was different speeds at which ships traveled. So he invented a new ship, and he also discovered that different currents travel at different places. So crossing the ocean, he uncovered the quickest and most expedient way to do it. He discovered that oil dispersed on water differently. So he walked around with little vials of oil and would randomly pour it into ponds to see the effects. He developed weather patterns. He developed musical instruments, numerous patents in terms of business. He was ridiculously successful in business. He funded the independence of the United States of America via his relationship to France. He was an ultimate diplomat. He edited, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," is his line, that all men are created equal, insert women, as well, please. And so he developed the first library, the first insurance company, the first fire hall, the list is so insane. The influence is so insane. But I'll give you one example of why I love the guy. He had a friend, he had a business contact or whatever when he was Postmaster General, who was an enemy. Was constantly disparaging him, constantly saying bad things about him. And he's like, how do I change this individual? And so what he would do is he'd say, hey, I know you have this world famous book. I'd love to read it. Can I borrow it? He borrowed it, returned it promptly within 3 days, and said, this book is unbelievable. You're so wise to have bought this book. The individual's like, oh, okay, well, that's really nice. Thank you for the note and thank you for whatever. A week later, he asked to borrow another book. Same thing. And the individual said, basically, oh, I'm the type of person who loans things. I'm the type of person who borrows things. I'm of benefit. So he changed the person via that individual's actions from the inside out. He also changed the way that he viewed Benjamin Franklin, because now he saw him as somebody who was trustworthy, who kept his word, who was academic, who was well-read, who was like-minded. So he leveraged psychology against his enemies. And it just gets fascinating. So, okay.
You're helping me solve my problems as we speak. The gears are turning.
Like, the individual is so, unheard of. In terms of his scientific acumen alone, never mind his political acumen, his honesty, his integrity, like it's just overwhelming, his contributions. By the way, the modern day equivalent of somebody who's worthy of analysis like this is Lee Kuan Yew. The only reason I know to speak of Lee Kuan Yew is because of Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger said, you should emulate Benjamin Franklin. So I bought his biographies and started reading them. And Charlie Munger produced a number of lectures available on YouTube. His Caltech talk, his University of Michigan talk. This is unbelievable. We basically are in the presence of a living legend. Reading 10 to 15 books a day. He's now 96 and he's been doing this since he was a teenager. Like, the amount of intelligence on the guy. He's read more biographies, I think, than anybody else alive. And so that's cool. He wrote a book called Poor Charlie's Almanac, which is based on Benjamin Franklin's almanac. But in it is the kind of the wit and wisdom, the collections of some of Charlie Munger's speeches. In one of those speeches, he says, if you only buy one book, buy this for everybody in your family. It's a book called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion by Dr. Cialdini. And he lays out even more Benjamin Franklin type principles for how people are being taken advantage of, how to be aware if you're being taken advantage of, how to influence, how to sell. And so there's not going to be enough time for me to go into the levels of details within these books. However, I'd highly recommend it. It's all value-add stuff.
Awesome. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway for a conversation like this for anybody who's watching at home, if they hadn't been yet turned on to Benjamin Franklin or Charlie Munger or Cialdini or anyone else that you've mentioned. I think, hopefully, if you check them out, you'd probably come to the same conclusions that Jeff has, in that it's worth a peek. So maybe just circling back to Munger for those in the audience at home, as you did for Benjamin Franklin, could you summarize Munger's bio briefly?
Munger was born in the United States. He actually worked for Warren Buffett's grandfather in a grocery store. He became a lawyer, I believe at Harvard. And he also worked for the Army in World War II, where he was a weather analysis. Even how he got into that was they do a standard IQ test, and his was through the roof. And they're like, we need you in analysis and intelligence. So cool. Munger started a law firm, which still exists. It has the name Munger in it in California. But his most prized, in terms of professional achievements, was he met Warren Buffett and became the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway.
Yes.
Via that process, he became a billionaire. But that's not the most fascinating part. The most fascinating part is how bright he is and the wisdom that he has. Listening to Charlie Munger talk about any profession is just insane. He rips finance individuals apart. He rips auditors apart. He rips accountants apart. But in a...
He does it in a classy way, right?
Yes, and in a humorous way.
Yeah.
Like a living legend of wisdom is how I would describe him. And so the lessons that he's taught, he runs a business called Daily Journal. He's their chairman of the board. the Daily Journal was in the newsprint business, and then it became a micro niche where it it printed legal transcripts, so court records and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So disseminated to a bunch of lawyers. And then he discovered that the entire print business, you got to remember over the years they bought a number of newspapers. The print business was obviously going down, internet was obviously going up. He turned the Daily Journal into a technology company.
Mm-hmm.
So courts needed searchable evidence, previous court records, right? So all that stuff needed
Quickly
to be
and
documented.
efficiently.
And exactly. And he turned Daily Journal into a tech company that meets the unique needs of courts. So think of the layers of government and bureaucracy and tendering that's involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the reason that he can compete in that is because it's so damn hard.
Yeah.
So in his 90s, he converted the Daily Journal into a tech company. And this is such a low percentage of his net worth.
Oh, yeah.
But the entire thing is worthy of analysis. And by the way, for free, you could go on YouTube and watch Daily Journal meetings where he just answers question after questions from shareholders, and it's sheer brilliance and funny. So there's my referral of the day.
It is funny. Great. So yes, definite recommendation. If you haven't yet come across Too Much Charlie Munger, if you just type in Charlie Munger, Munger, on YouTube, and even spend 5 minutes listening, you'll likely be blown away. If you have any interest in business or finance or even entrepreneurship, there's so many good takeaways. So awesome. Thank you for a little bit of a history lesson and some serious bios. It's like we're getting a 3-pack. We're doing a profile on Jeff Gilbert, and we get 2 more for the price of 1. So thank you very much. Now, I'm very interested to maybe talk to you a bit more in the future about the lecture stuff. I know you mentioned it. I think that it will be very interesting to see how the landscape unfurls as everybody goes back to school in the fall, as post-secondary kind of starts up again, as K to 12 starts up again. But especially to see the virtual lecture space and to see what happens. I'm hoping that we see a ton of innovation. I think there's been a bit of stagnation across the video conferencing platform space. But I guess I'm curious to talk to you maybe a bit today and also in future about how you see an effective lecture being delivered in a digital environment. When you can't have that natural, like even you're delivering a lecture to 50 people, maybe, let's say, it's like the body language is massive. And you can tell that if you sit in a Jeff Gilbert lecture, because actually, you talk for a few minutes and, not everybody falls asleep right away. And then, there's movement, there's things happening. People are turning around and talking to each other, and you seem to like that and play on it. How do you imagine that might occur in this new modern environment? Do you have any ideas or tips or tricks up your sleeve?
No, I have zero, and I'm scared. So I've taught for like 10 years, but I've also done a ton of lecturing and stuff over the years. I'm quite comfortable going up in front of a crowd and speaking.
Yeah.
I have never taught a course online. I've never, what do? Do you pick 2 or 3 students at random and blow them up on your screen so that you can kind of keep track of, are they paying attention?
I think
my lectures are 3 hours long.
Yeah.
As exciting as I can make auditing be, and I'll try my damnedest, one of the things that I do is I'm reading the body language. If people are starting to zone out, I'll bring in a crazy story. I'll change my voice. I'll change my understanding. I'll bring in a video. Okay, can I do this? Can it be as successful as I think it's been in the past? What could I change? And I'm throwing the question right back at you. And so, as I've been preparing for September to start, you're one of the people that comes to mind. If you've studied John's background or whatever, video production's been part of what you do. Making things exciting has been part of what you do. You're kind of a tech geek.
Yeah, and that's true.
I know it's true. And so I'm going to chuck that question right back to you and say, I need help. I need you to be creative. I need you to think through what the best Zoom lecture is that you've ever attended and what they did to make it good, because I need help.
Well, we spoke about it a bit on the phone before, and I guess I shared my reverence of another individual with you, Marshall McLuhan, who's a Canadian media studies genius, and his big message was the medium is the message. And so I feel like there's been a lot of resistance to technology and tools and features and buttons and kind of eye rolling and all this stuff going on. But we don't roll our eyes about the technology that is a book or the technology that is a newspaper. I think it's just a typical resistance to the new. And so in that proposition, I guess what I'm saying is that I feel like those people who curate and deliver the best and most impactful lectures are going to be those who embrace the medium fully, meaning you figure out how the video platform, you figure out the conferencing platform, you figure out exactly all the tools and the settings, you figure out all the buttons and the features. It's like you become a master of a medium. People don't roll their eyes nowadays thinking about people who've mastered the art of newspaper or book publication the same way they do when, you know, people start talking about buttons and features and specifications for software. You know, I feel like a lot of people in the business community this day and age go, oh yeah, that's just noise, like all the buttons and features and tech specs and all this type of stuff. And it's like, no, that's part of the message, right? So I just imagine that those lecturers at the universities that do a brilliant job is like, you jump into the lecture and you watch them use Zoom or Hangouts or the Cisco solutions or any other number of platforms, and you watch them for 2 minutes and you go, holy crap, this person knows the shit out of this platform. Like, they've really practiced, they've got time on stick, and that's the message. And the message is, I care. The message is, I care about making this experience as enjoyable, as engaging, as impactful, and as seamless as possible to you. And it's going to be those instructors who jump on, I believe, and are fiddling with buttons and settings and for 5 minutes and everybody, oh yeah, right? And it's like, the message is, well, I didn't take the 10 hours to practice using this platform before I even delivered my first lecture for it to be a seamless and enjoyable experience out of the gates. So I really think there's going to be massive fallout. I think it's going to be those lecturers from day one, lecture one, put in the time and did their homework. And then those lecturers who day one are going, oh, how do I get this input set up and that, and the other thing. And the class is just going to go, There is a challenge, I think, that you're going to battle. And I think the biggest challenge that you're going to battle is that when you log on, whether it's a class of 10 or 100, 95% of people are just going to turn their camera off, especially if it's a longer lecture. And I see that in tons of lectures. We see it in webinars. We see it in all sorts of video conferencing mediums. Part of the allure of the virtual lecture or long form kind of, you know, presentation is, well, I can turn my camera off, I can mute my mic, I can get a coffee, I can drink, I can type some notes, I can do other emails, I can multitask. And in a physical setting, when you're delivering a lecture, immediately in the first 5 minutes, nobody's thinking of multitasking, right? Like, as soon as I get a taste of you and your interest and your fervor and what makes you a great lecturer, is like, the thought of picking up the phone to text message just vanishes. But it's such low hanging fruit in the virtual environment that I think that will be difficult. And what is a solution to that? I don't know, because I think trying to find software, trying to configure your software such that people can't turn their camera off, immediate invasion of privacy. And so I think it'll be those lecturers who find a way to honestly and transparently approach that situation with their students to say, look, guys, we're looking for maximal engagement. We're looking to deliver something of value and interest to you. We want to know what that means to you. And one of the ways in which I imagine I'll be able to do that well is if we, to the best of our ability, try to keep our cameras on and try to stay engaged. And I know there might be 30 of us, but you know, I can see all 30 of you laid out on this screen, and it's amazing how good the human eye is at picking up movement. It's like, I can see when someone raises their hand. I can see when somebody, you know, has a little bit of body language. It's going to be so much tougher to pick out, but the human body and brain is attuned to doing it. I think we're ready to do it. It's going to be tough, but I think we're up for the challenge. I think especially you are up for the challenge.
That's cool.
Well, The other challenge, and I experience this challenge every week on the live stream, I look like a lunatic because I'm I watch the videos after. I've got, Twitch on here, Streamlabs OBS on here, my script over here, my chat over here, I got 15 things going, and you'll have a bunch, right? You'll have 30 students and some software and some settings or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, where's my notes? Where's the this? Where's the that? And then you watch it after. It's like, oh, I'm still getting the hang of it, and I think it takes time on stick to finally get to a point. I'm only now at episode 16 finally getting to a place where I actually feel like I can control all of my peripheral requirements and focus in to at least a slightly better degree. You'll still see my eyes darting all over the place, but so that's that.
I love the way your brain works.
I love the way yours works. It's the feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual. That's cool.
Like, you could tell my brain's already partially to where yours is at. In other words, it's not September yet. I'm already starting, and I'm already I think I need to reach out. I already did some webinars and some training, which I didn't find all that useful to date. I'm drafting my course outline right now. I've made it mandatory. Participation is still going to be 10% because I want to be engaging, even though it's more difficult to have participation during this time.
Yeah.
And I made it mandatory that microphones and video be on. With clearance first from U of M.
Yeah.
But they're like, yeah, for sure, that's cool. And so I'm setting myself up for a challenge, but I'm like, don't do it if you don't want to be challenged, right?
Yeah.
Like, basically, at the end of the day, with most classes, you could just assign a textbook and say, I'm going to test from the textbook and go home.
Yeah.
So then what's the point of the lecture? Well, in my mind, the lecture brings in insight, creativity, real life. They bring in how their brain works, analysis. They bring in not just reading theoretical, but here's the practical application of what worked and what didn't work, and when, what pitfalls to avoid. So I'm still passionate about all that stuff, and I'll take a stab at doing it electronically. But to me, it's still a fairly steep mountain to climb.
Certainly, it certainly is. Well, I think it'll also hopefully too be maybe a bit of an equalizer. I'm kind of hoping because, I guess I'll just be plain about it. It's like I feel overwhelmed every time I do this. Right. And even no matter how much time on stick I get, I think I fall into that category of relishing the challenge, of seeking out the challenge. So
the other equalizer I'm thinking is, over the years, I've noticed that about 10% of the students do all the talking. There's a good 60% that will raise their hand about statistically once a month, get some participation marks, and then go back to never talking. And then there's another good 20-30% who will not speak, period. And I've noted that could be from a number of issues. It could be related to personality. In other words, very shy, afraid of public speaking. It could be a cultural issue. So there's a number of things that could be causing that. But I'm like, well, technology could actually assist these individuals. Here, don't talk, just put a chat, right? Like, ask me a question or respond to a question via chat.
Yeah.
If they're more comfortable doing so, to me, that counts for participation.
That's a good point.
Whereas in class, that wouldn't have been an option.
Awesome. I'd be excited to hear back and check in and see if that type of stuff starts happening in lectures and if some of your hypotheses play out. So I could definitely see that. I wonder what everybody in the audience thinks if you find yourself in that category of people who might be slightly more silent in a lecture or in an in-person presentation. If you had the chat option, would you be using it more? And I wonder how people see that, because I think you're right. I think you're onto something there. Alrighty, so we got a bit of an intro to Jeff. We talked about some of his biggest influences. We jumped into discussing lecture in the new environment and using our new media tools. We were going to talk about corporate oversight, but I think we kind of grazed over a little bit of corporate oversight when we dove into the audit discussion and discussed the audit a little bit. And so, with 15 minutes left, I think if you're cool with it, I'd propose that we skip on to our third topic, and that is entrepreneurial risk and reward. And this is something I know that you are insanely interested in. And so, I wonder if, with that broad of a canvas to play with, you could lay out maybe a little bit of your framework for thinking about entrepreneurial risk and reward. I've heard your spatterings, and maybe I'll try to focus it a little bit. If I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm a solopreneur or a founder, or even a young owner operator, young in terms of my firm age, how should I be thinking about risk and reward? And what types of things should I be worried about? And what types of things should I be striving towards?
When I read Munger's first major investment, it was when I believe Petro-Canada was going from a government entity to a private entity. And the shares were trading at $19, but it was going to be guaranteed that the sale was going to go through at $21, if I remember correctly. Munger bet more than 100% of his net worth because it was such a lock. It's the poker equivalent of having a royal flush. You have a high probability payout. And he is a strategic use of investment thinker. In other words, he thinks probabilistically. Mm-hmm. What are the odds of a return? And so one of the concepts that comes into this is margin of safety, right? How do you protect yourself from downside risk? Now, another thing that comes to mind is a book called The Dando Investor by Monish Pabrai. Monish was an entrepreneur, started a tech company. He did this while he worked at a normal 9-to-5 job. And his performance when he first started was unbelievable. He was like a crazy, amazing employee. And then his performance started going down. And they're like, after a year, Manish, we noticed that you're still okay, but you're not quite where you were before. And he's like, yeah, I'm running another business. I'm putting all my priorities on that. I'm doing just enough not to get fired here.
Straight up.
And they're like, well, why didn't you just quit? And he's like, I needed to guarantee a certain level of income so that I could afford to live. He turned that into like a $20 million business, sold it. And from there, he started a fund, the Pabrai Funds, it's called. And he explains in what's called the Dando Investor, that book, the entrepreneurial mindset, which is actually, he wants as little risk as possible, as much reward as possible. So he searches and searches and searches to find high return, low risk, which means he rejects 99.999% of things that come across his desk. It's too high, it's too expensive, what have you. He explained a multi-billionaire family called the Bat family. The Bat family bought cheap motels in the 1970s in the United States. They bought their first one. They basically fired everybody who worked there, and they hired only family who also stayed in the hotel in one small room. They performed all cleaning, all cooking, all services, all maintenance. They also reduced the price. So they were the cheapest motel by a significant margin because they didn't have any corporate overseers. They didn't have any professionals coming in to do the work. Mm-hmm. They did the work themselves. Mm-hmm. They then bought the business for super cheap, the first motel. From that, they levered and bought the next motel. And you know where the story goes. They expanded, keeping that exact same model, low cost, low price, until they became a multi-billionaire family with low risk throughout the entire time that they did this. And so this is one way to think about risk and reward. Another way that I would think about it comes actually to you, which is when you were finishing your commerce degree there and we're chatting, like, well, what career options are there? And you meet certain personality types, and they don't belong reporting to a low-level manager, reporting to a senior-level manager, reporting to an executive manager, reporting to a CEO, 7 rungs down, doing tedious work where they're billing out at X, they're getting paid Y, that spread is being made by the 7 layers above them. Mm-hmm. You're one of those. And so one of the ways that I think about risk and reward is personality-based. There's some individuals who would absolutely thrive in that environment. It's very structured, it's very known. Your day-to-day job is largely going to be predictable.
And
There's
so
some individuals
that
who
would
are
be
more
lower risk?
entrepreneurial. Well, it depends how you define risk.
Okay.
Like one of the ways that I've heard risk being described is, do you look on your deathbed, if you will, at your life and say, I never tried anything? That could be a risk, a horrific risk to some individuals. Some define it as the probabilistic nature of having a structured environment, a likely return. By the way, a pet peeve of mine, people who define volatility as risk.
Yeah.
That is the dumbest way of looking at markets. For the life of me, I don't understand it. The markets are full of irrational people, full of panic and ridiculous hope at times. And so stock goes like this. That's people overreacting and underreacting to a bunch of white noise. Over the long term, the company's performance is going to be what the company returns in terms of cash flow. So over the short term, I couldn't care less if a company's going up and down. That's not real risk.
Mm-hmm.
Real risk is a hyper-aggressive CEO. Real risk is using debt every 5 seconds for everything. Real risk is ridiculous acquisitions via debt, or lots of mergers and acquisitions which companies don't necessarily align.
Mm-hmm.
So embedded in my long diatribe here is a bunch of different ways of analyzing risk and a bunch of different ways of analyzing reward, but of course keeping in mind the human mind, i.e. the individual involved with this. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. And sorry, I interrupted you as you were going on to the entrepreneurial personality type, I guess.
If you ever have, what's the guy's name who started Virgin?
Richard Branson?
Yeah, if you ever read his biography, first of all, he's not actually risk averse. He's very, very careful. He started Virgin Airlines for virtually no money. He found a Boeing jet or whatever, and he basically said, could I pay you with future payments if Virgin takes off? Like, there was no risk. He was very prudent in how he enters into the companies, and is always assuming that it's going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like, how do I protect it and go in with a minimal amount of money so that if it does fail, I have low losses. But if I do win, I win big.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to mention is that he's had numerous heavy bad things happen to him. He was found to be avoiding certain taxes when he was in England with his CD business at the time with Virgin Records. And he almost lost his business and almost lost his shirt more than one time. That type of personality, though, is never going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
It's another way of looking at risk reward. He's not going. It doesn't make a difference. You could bankrupt him tomorrow. He's going to reform. He's going to, like a lotus flower, recreate something new, something creative. And long term, an individual like that is bound to be success because some of this is going to hit, especially if he's willing to learn from mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. So what do you think it is? You talked about psychology and personality types. You laid out the case of the individual who is going to fit in well in a corporate environment in a junior position and then climbing the ranks and slowly minimizing that spread. What are the other personality types? What personality types and psychological components that you think lend itself well to entrepreneurship? And I know that you think there's like a very wide range, but are there any hallmarks or if
yes?
Yeah.
And I don't know how to articulate it properly. When I gave that one lecture which you attended, you were not like the other people in the room. So your eye contact, you're bouncing in your chair a little bit. There's a lot of energy. And when we chat after, and the creativity, the outside the box thinking that's coming out of your brain, boom idea, like it's like explosions. That type of personality does not belong going through a very regimented, very bureaucratic, because it kills the energy. Now, it can work in a corporate environment where creativity is flourished, and it can work in certain corporate environments where leashes are given, is what I call it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there's a balance always to be found between trust and accountability, controls, overseen,
Yes.
right? So like a military, like a classic organizational theory type case, you need structure, you need clear chain of authority. I like organizations though that allow creativity, that say we're going to give individuals leashes and trust. Go out, now. You could do very well in that type of corporate environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first type of corporate environment to me that becomes scary. So let's call it more artistic, more outside the box thinking, more creativity. Let's call it high energy.
High in openness, maybe.
Yes. Um, no, but I am very against putting people in categories and then saying you are in this category. This is exactly, and you can never work in that category.
Yes.
No, there's a hell of a lot of gray with everybody and everything. There's a hell of a lot of gray in the business world, in the government. Like, I don't care what it is. There's a whole lot of gray in entrepreneurial environments. There's people who want overly structured entrepreneurialism. Then there's people who are like, I need a pivot every 5 seconds. Some are successful, some are not. So I don't like, here's the rule. Instead, I like, here's broad ways of thinking that may be applicable. Or here's non-data driven Gilbert observations over the years for the type of personalities that work. I'll give you an example again. In commerce, there was one individual, and I hear him on the phone in between calls or in between classes. I'm like, what's going on over there? And he's like, oh, I'm considering selling my rental property and 3 of my cars. Dude, why do you own 3 cars? Oh, well, I got my dealer's license when I saw that at the time, this is early 2000s, the exchange rate was higher, right? So Canadian dollar was above the US. So because I can make money off the flip, including the foreign currency, I could buy US dollars for cheaper. And so he's like, there's a large market for whatever it was at the time, trucks or what have you, or SUVs. So I would bring those in, sell the US cars in Canada, make a profit. So he had 3 of those type of vehicles sitting there. Also had a rental property. Why are you considering selling the rental property? Oh, because if I sell the rental property, I could use that capital to invest in a private business where if I invest, I'm also getting senior management responsibility, so I could leverage that. Now, that individual is to date the most successful entrepreneur I know out in Alberta. That individual does not belong in a classic bureaucratic environment. In fact, when he went through that bureaucratic environment, they wanted to hire him after. One of those ones where you go through 5 different departments, over the course of the summer and what have you. And he's like, I'm out. I got to do my own thing.
Mm-hmm. They tried to put him through like a management development program or something
exactly.
like that. Yeah.
Right. And he's thinking, can I buy this entire business?
Yeah.
Right. Well, how do I change this entire model?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. He's not thinking about how do I do a really good budget to submit to the corporate controller.
Awesome. Well, maybe, how are you doing for time? Do you have a hard 1 p.m. stop?
I do not have a hard one. I have a hard 1:30.
Okay. Are you cool if we maybe go 5 or 10 minutes over?
Sure.
Okay, great. I think there is some really big value to deliver here. And I think I'm a bit of a case study for it. And maybe I'll tell a brief story and then ask a quick question. And the brief story is, Jeff's kind of alluded to it, but I was finishing a BCom myself. I had been entrepreneurial in the past, but even still as a 31-year-old when we met, I think I was still starting to figure out who I was. I still struggle with it to this day. But for whatever reason, I was caught in what I thought was a locked-in decision I had to make between pursuing a CFA and a CPA. And I was trying to do, should I get an accounting or a finance major? And will the accounting major open up a CFA avenue for me and a CPA avenue, whereas will a CFA major kind of lock me into a CFA route? I liked the work. I liked the analysis. I wasn't the best at, the accounting per se, or even any of the quant in either of those disciplines. But I figured if I could put myself to it and do it. But I loved the analysis, and I loved the bigger picture stuff too. And I laid out that proposition to Jeff, and after hanging out, we would go for lunch every now and then. Jeff steered me straight clear of it and said, "What are you doing? Like, no, you need to go and found your own thing." And so I can attribute Auxisis and its existence to a lot of people, but I think I'd have to say I would attribute its existence in large part to you and your advice, and even sometimes when it was not just advice, when it was just sharing stories and wisdom. So A, thank you. But B, I know you've laid out your interest in working with other entrepreneurs and other founders. And so I guess herein lies the question. The brief question is, how open are you to discussing entrepreneurial pursuits with young entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs, any type of entrepreneur, people who are considering founding or striking out on their own? Are you open to that sort of thing?
100%.
Okay.
All dependent on time commitments and what have you, but yeah, I've done it before. So the lens of somebody who's a forensic accountant, CPA, who's read a bunch of books, is typically different than other lenses.
Yes.
So to the extent that I could add value, what a rewarding thing to do, and what a cool thing to do. I consider that to be the equivalent of volunteering for a not-for-profit. In other words, you're helping an individual, you're helping them fulfill somewhat of a dream or a business or their goals. Or the other thing too is, if my, let's call it financial acumen, could be of assistance. If that's a lens that's missing from individuals, it's like, okay, well, then I feel like, okay, it's a value add relationship.
Awesome.
In life, I'm always searching for those, right? Is there a strategic partnership? Forget financial returns for a moment, forget investing. Just, is there a value add to be had? And if yes, I'm interested in exploring.
Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, I think a number of people in the network may find that of interest. I've got another question for you, and then we'll kind of move on and wind down. But one of the ideas that we've been kicking around at Auxisis, and this got put on hold with the pandemic, we wanted to run a day-long workshop for independents, freelancers, solopreneurs, owner-operators, at early stage. And the thought was that we would put together a group of speakers, maybe 6 speakers, and we might have somebody who ran a bookkeeping firm, and somebody who did leadership development, and somebody who ran a creative agency, and all the rest of it, and give them each 45 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes to speak, a big Q&A, maybe even a fireside chat over the lunch hour and a catered lunch hour and all the rest of it. And the thought was we were hopefully going to do one of these in the fall for our closer network. So for the Auxisis ICs and anybody who's closely connected, thinking maybe it'd be a 20-person thing, and then maybe even if that works, turn it into a bigger, more regular thing. So simply the question, would you be open to an invite for serving as a speaker at an event like this?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Awesome.
Let's just be careful though, depending on what the topic is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What would you want to speak on?
Well, in other words, technically I run my own small business because I do enough consulting and contract work. But I don't do taxes.
Yeah. No, right. We'd have tax someone else for tax and bookkeeping. Right. And yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tax, bookkeeping, I'm familiar at a light level. I know the questions to ask. I like individuals who practice in those fields to be the ones to provide opinions there. In terms of, you want some business stories, you want the history of General Electric, but also the history of or where I think the macroeconomy or microeconomy is going in terms of freelancing. I'm full of opinions and happy to share.
Awesome.
That, and also some of my thought processes on due diligence might be of value. So.
Yeah, this is where my brain turns to in terms of providing value, and maybe this circles back to the topic that we skipped of corporate governance. And in my estimation, that's that's one of the things as a solopreneur with a firm with ambitions of growth that's in the early stages, is I have tried to put in mechanisms of control and governance in my own business, but I know that just due to the nature and the stage that the business is at, that compared to the corporate world, they're probably woefully inadequate. So I'd be curious to hear from you, what you might suggest that somebody as a solopreneur or even freelancer might be thinking about by way of governance and diligence?
I'm a believer in people who make the decision should bear the consequences of those decisions. I'm a believer in base internal controls.
Yes.
I am not a big believer in overly stringent internal control environments for most environments, because it says to your employees, it says to your partners, I don't trust you.
Mm-hmm.
I need to micromanage your every waking moment. And so, like, what exactly does that say? Well, I trust you to do the work of my complex client who has a complex challenge, and to do a crazy, whatever, marketing scheme, business plan, crazy, multi-million-dollar budget, but I don't trust you with 2 cents petty cash.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way of running an environment. That's not my way. But that's not to say no internal controls, because I've seen that, and people will walk all over you.
Yep.
And you get ripped off.
Yeah.
That's unacceptable too. And the other thing too is kind of as a little bit of a theme is individuals who do, let's call it, unethical things, I have major problems with. Another theme that I would bring to the table would be honesty and transparency in all ways. And tone at the top matters greatly for this, but there's no games.
Yeah.
Record exactly what you did, when you did it, how you did it. Be open and honest and transparent, and you, being the leader, the same. This builds trust, this builds accountability, this builds expectation management. It builds just a whole bunch of good things. Last rule that I'll just bring to the table is keep it simple. Overly complex environments, when things don't need to be overly complex, I'm not a big fan of. Things get lost in it, management get lost in it, you get lost in filling out forms that are of little or questionable value. So keep it simple. For most businesses, it's like you should be getting a measure of something as simple as 2 variables, growth and profit, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't need to be a 75-page document with the balanced scorecard of 92 components. People are going to read it and glaze over and be like, this is overly bureaucratic and not value add.
Yeah. Well, then on the diligence side, I think that's it, is like, where's that entrepreneurial sweet spot for those elements, for the control mechanisms, for the diligence, for the risk mitigation, for that type of stuff. And like, for me, I know I should have contracts and process, but if I present my prospects or clients or even the people I work with like an overly complicated process or a 30-page contract or like any of that type of stuff, it's like, that's not going to fly for me, right? I gotta find that sweet spot. Where is it? Where am I doing, as you call it, how did you call it? The bare minimum controls? Or
the base controls need to always be done. So, you're in your nice looking office right there. If you had, you're not in this business, but if you were in the business where you were accepting a bunch of cash, and you had a safe there, and the safe was perpetually open, and I'm not making this story up, this was on an audit, where I never saw a safe door closed or locked. That's an example of a base control not being implemented. You have the safe, the key mechanism here is to close the door and lock it. And so if, for example, you're missing the base controls in terms of anybody could sign a check on behalf of your company, that's an epic fail.
Yeah.
Right? No, you need to lock this stuff down, right?
Yeah.
However, do you need to have a ridiculous process with 22 layers of signatures and authorizations? No. The risk reward, in order to prevent an error, you're spending thousands of dollars, thousands of human hours, and the value add's not there.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. I think it would be really cool to have an event like that and to hear your thoughts on the sweet spot, maybe.
I'm in.
Great. Okay, winding things down. I guess my thought is I am extremely grateful to Jeff for joining us today, but I'm also extremely grateful for Jeff's role in the journey that is Auxesis. And I'm also suspicious. I know there are a number of independent contractors that work with us on a regular basis in the live chat watching. and hopefully a few others will watch this after the fact on YouTube. And it seems apparent to me, and this is yet to be known, but some of those things that are difficult to understand or grasp about us and how we do things and the way that we think, I think today you've helped tell a big part of that story. And so anybody who might be watching, who's been through Auxesis processes, who's engaged on projects, who's done work with us and collaborated with us, I think they might watch this episode and hear you speak and go, oh, aha, here's where a big part of that comes from. So thanks.
Cool.
All right. To wind things down, I know we're 10 minutes over, but I'm curious. Jeff, what are you up to for the weekend? What do you like to do for fun? What's going on outside of work? What's happening?
Outside of work, I got 2 kids. And so tomorrow we'll be off to the beach, going out to a relatively deserted, so it's fairly safe lake, and watching kids play and all that good family time. Likely a barbecue out at the lake. And then Sunday, I think it's supposed to rain, and I have to do some grocery shopping, contain your excitement. That's about it for the weekend.
Cool. I heard you bought a pool.
Yes, by pool, an Amazon above ground, crappy 2.5 foot kids pool, which, by the way, for those of you who are curious about this, requires a fair bit of maintenance. Filter pumps, heaters, chemicals, test strips to make sure the water's safe. So anyways, there's a heads up. If you go down that road, kids have an absolute blast, but there's some work involved.
Awesome. And how about your own personal interests? Obviously, I think we've uncovered that reading is one of them. But if you had, let's say maybe the kids were away at a sleepover and your partner was out of town and it was just you and you had an evening, what would you be on the TV on the couch watching Netflix with a pizza? What would you do with your time?
I can't watch normal TV. It's not for me, and I can't watch most movies. It's not for me. There's a guy named Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman is a notable lecturer in math. If you ever have a chance to YouTube those kind of lectures, I love watching documentaries. I love watching individuals, like podcasts, like listening to Joe Rogan's podcast where he brings on some brilliant individual that I've never heard of before, or maybe not even somebody brilliant, but just somebody who has a different point of view or a unique story to tell. That's my idea of relaxation. That to me is fun. One of the things I usually discuss is the book that I'm currently reading, so I'll mention it now.
Great.
I'm reading Intrepid, it's called. This book is very old. It's the story of the most famous spy in existence, a guy whose last name is Stevenson, who was born in Winnipeg, which I did not know about, and he was the #1 World War II British spy who helped fight against the Nazis in World War II.
Wow.
The story so far, I'm only about on chapter 5, is absolutely fascinating, including basically treason, going against Chamberlain, the prime minister at the time, because Chamberlain wanted to just sign peace agreements and wanted to close his eyes and pretend there wasn't a problem. So literally committing treason in concert with Hoover and FDR. So anyways, so far the book's fascinating, and the way this guy's brain works, about 25 steps ahead of everybody else, is also fascinating.
Wow, incredible. Well, I think a ton of value and great recommendations there. Awesome to learn a little bit more about you and your interests, but I also think we're going to have to maybe do a bit of a quick audit and throw some links in on this video in its existence after the fact, because I think there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that might perk the ears up of a few individuals, and so we'll try and pepper a trail of breadcrumbs, some links and references to some of the stuff that Jeff's talked about today. So, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. A pleasure.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend too.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us, watching on Twitch. Thanks for anybody watching this after the fact. And of course, as always, thank you to all of our frontline workers and essential services workers for keeping us safe and doing what they do so well. So much appreciated. Hope you have a fantastic weekend, everybody out there. Over and out.